So, hi. Welcome to the 50/50 Project, which is the lofty title I've devised for what is essentially just a list, really. A list of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived now. I've got a milestone birthday coming up as I'm recording this, and I think a well-adjusted person would probably just plan a party. But I think I'm going to make a bunch of weird PowerPoint podcast thingies instead, because that's who I am as a person, for better or worse. Next week, I'll actually get down to business with number one, and the plan is to then count up to 50 from there over the course of the next year. But today, I'm inclined to start with just a short introduction into the project itself. So this idea was born on a really shitty afternoon in mid-January, which I think we can all agree is one of the longest and most onerous months on the calendar. I was standing in the windows of my apartment in Indianapolis, looking down into the city street. I happen to live right in the heart of downtown, and if you decide to come back and listen to enough of these episodes, you'll eventually hear the fire trucks from the giant city center station that's just down the street. I like the bustle of this area mostly, and that afternoon I was just taking a minute to look at the beginnings of rush hour, checking out all the end-of-day traffic moving past, and the evening coming in through between the buildings, and all the windows and the other high-rises starting to pop white and yellow as lights started to come on for the evening. And on this particular afternoon, from about half a block away, the bells of Christ Church Cathedral ringing out this really intricate, really artful melody, announcing the start of their Thursday evensong service. It was a beautiful, rich, vivid scene, full of color and song and energy and life. And I was so incredibly annoyed by all of it. I was sick of myself, I was sick of everything around me, and I could almost physically feel myself starting to roll over into a piss-poor mood. And all because, my friends, there was snow in the forecast that day. The man in front of the map that morning had looked me right in the eye and promised me a real, measurable, beautiful, fluffy snow. And I had been so happy about that. So, side note, I've recently moved about 1,000 miles north from the Atlanta suburbs in this sweet little cottage tucked away in the North Georgia woods, all the way back up to Indiana. And that's because of work, and that's because of where friends and family live, but it's also in no small part because of the weather. I've always been really impacted by the weather ever since I was a kid. And I cut against the tide on this one, friends. I hate summer. I live for fall. I love winter, and I dread spring. I know it's not the norm, but I feel these preferences really deeply in my bones. And I felt the loss of winter so keenly the 8 years I lived in Georgia. And Georgia's a gorgeous place. I have nothing but love in my heart for Georgia, but it was all wrong for me, climatologically speaking. And I had waited so long and wanted so badly to get back to a proper Midwestern winter. And for me, a proper Midwestern winter means an absolute assload of snow. But to be honest, this first winter back in the heartland has been really disappointing winter weather-wise. And so on this particular afternoon in mid-January, which had turned out to be completely snow-free, despite all predictions to the contrary, I just stood there in my window, looking out at this vibrant, beautiful pageant of my new city. But I felt robbed and wronged and thwarted. And I felt a little marooned in Indiana, with no snow to show for all the miles I'd come, or all the boxes I'd carried. And as I stood there, I was doing this thing I do, this thing I've tried so hard over the years to stop doing. I was letting the one thing that was absent overshadow everything interesting or vibrant or beautiful that was present. And then I started doing another terrible, counterproductive, mood-blasting thing that I do, which is to upbraid myself for feeling what I felt in that moment. It's an old, familiar script, and it runs through my head something like this. You are 49 years old, jackass, and you should know by now that you can't fight the weather, that you can't choose it, and that only a fool lets something so unpredictable and so uncontrollable govern their happiness even for a minute. So first, I was mad about the lack of snow. And then I was mad at everything else for, existing, I guess. Then I got mad at myself for being mad. And on the surface, yeah, it's weird to get that angsty about the weather in the first place. But in retrospect, it wasn't about the weather, or at least it wasn't all about the weather, because there was a bigger storm headed for me. Just before I fell into that meteorological death spiral, I had been standing in that same window, thinking about the big, wonderful, terrible, scary birthday on the horizon. The turn of the year had put it in my head, and the flip of the calendar to January 2024 brought it all front and center. I was going to be 50 soon. 50. 5-0. And that seemed impossible. It seemed scary. So while my conscious mind made a quick, slippery little shift and started to ask, is it ever going to snow? My gut and my soul were still wrestling with other questions. Big, haunting questions about what I had to show for all those years and all the pages of the calendar that had flipped in the past. Had I just wasted 50 years? Had I accomplished anything worth doing in all that time? And then, as the spiral continued to, spiral aggressively, I got all worked up about the weather and I found myself stuck in an old, silly emotional loop. And then I started to wonder if, in all that time, I had learned anything at all about anything. So clearly, it was time for a Snickers bar, followed by a nap, followed by some serious thought about what almost 50 years of experience and endeavor really does add up to for me, because it's not nothing. It's a lot of something. And the desire to pin it all down somehow and tally it all up is how this idea came into being. And it started that day with just a really basic list. 50 things I've learned in 50 years of being alive, in no particular order, and really for nobody other than for me. Then I started to realize that these 50 things seem to coalesce around about 10 universal categories, 10 topics that just about everybody wrestles with and works through. I found that I kept returning to the answers that I'd found to questions like, how do you make stuff creatively? How do you thrive in the workplace? And how do you manage conflict? What does it mean to pursue your own personal version of happiness? How do you take care of yourself, both body and soul? What is the proper relationship between yourself and the stuff that you own? And what's the deal with love anyway? And because of my training and my profession, I think, I also had a category of communications principles emerge. And of course, there's the truly existential stuff, which I put into a category that I'm just calling big ticket shit. And we'll deal with all of that later at the very end of the year when hopefully we're all feeling more up to it. Anyway, as an organizing principle sort of surfaced, this all started to seem like an auspicious time for me to raise the bar a little bit, learn something new, try something different, and maybe mold all of this into a podcast. So here we are. Starting today, I'm going to make a little podcast once a week for the next year. One short episode for each one of the 50 things, with maybe a couple bonus episodes thrown in here or there to round out the year. And next week, I'll really get down to business with number 1. But this week, here's a freebie, so to speak, a bonus nugget or something. And I have no idea what kind of number to assign it since it's not really one of the 50 things. But I think for right now, we'll just stick a 0 in front of it. So, number 0. You know more than you know you know. Even in those moments when you feel like it's all been for naught and you never learn and you seem mired in reiterations of the same mistakes and missteps, you know more than you know you know. I promise you that. On that shitty afternoon in mid-January, I knew far more than I thought I knew, and far more than I was giving myself credit for in that moment. Now it's true that even after 50 years, situations can still discombobulate me. Emotions can still surprise and overwhelm me. Circumstances can still make me feel like I know nothing about how to survive, let alone thrive, in certain pockets of the human experience. But then I take a sec, as I did that day, I settle, I pull my shit together, and I remember that I do know stuff. That I have some pretty vast stores of knowledge, actually, that I've earned and honed and put in the work for. I know, for example, that I shouldn't let the things I don't have occlude the bounty and the beauty of the things I do have. I know that it's stupid to get pissed off about the weather. And while knowing those things didn't prevent me from forgetting them and ruining that particular moment for myself, it does mean that I could come home to these insights more quickly, get my thoughts back on track sooner, dig through the layers to find the real problem more efficiently, and, process the issue just more effectively. I've even learned to respect and appreciate the practice of relearning the same damn thing over and over again. I know from my past life as an educator that repetition is actually a core part of the learning process. This is true in literacy development, it's true in technique development, it's even true to the process of cementing very basic facts in our mental repositories. One of my professors told me a long time ago that there's actually a whole neurological thing that is triggered by learning and then relearning something. When we learn something, initially it imprints on our hippocampus, tucked away as an episodic memory into this little seahorse-shaped thing in our brain. But when we've learned and then relearned, or grasped and then renewed our grasp on something enough times, the more we run and rerun that information through the old neural pathways, it begins to transcend its initial placement in the hippocampus, and it eventually gets encoded as long-term memory in our cerebral cortex, which is sort of up here-ish, I hope. By the way, please do not allow this extremely professional diagram of the human brain fool you into thinking that I'm speaking from a place of, neurological expertise. If you need advice on neuroscience, you should definitely find a different podcast, as I was an English major. I should also mention that my professor was describing a very specific type of stepwise learning in a classroom setting, like language acquisition or mathematical skill building, and he made no claims about how all of this applies to the process of just banging your head on the same life lesson over and over again. But I think there's something comforting here for those of us who are wondering why we have to keep reconfronting and relearning the most self-evident, most important, and even the most hard-won, well-earned understandings of how life works. So, for my part, I'm really trying to let go of that feeling of disappointment and of self-doubt that came over me that shitty afternoon in mid-January when I felt like I had forgotten something important again, when I felt like I should know better by now, when I wondered, will I ever learn? Because the answer is yeah, I will learn. And actually, yes, I have already learned. And in fact, yes, I am learning, even right now, even as we speak. Every time I take the opportunity to refresh or rerun and thereby refine the script of what I actually do know. Making this list and taking on this project has been an enormously rewarding kind of review session for me. It's helped me repeat and clarify and organize and categorize a lot of really helpful, important lessons that I have indeed learned. It's verified for me that I know more than I know sometimes. And I bet you do too. Now, before we get out of here for today, I feel called to add yet one more disclaimer about this whole thing. In thinking about this project, I've definitely been wrestling with the question of whether I'm qualified to give anybody advice about anything. And upon reflection, it turns out that no, I absolutely am not. So I won't. The 50 things aren't necessarily advice. They definitely are not instructions for living, and they're not admonitions of any kind. This is just a list of insights that I feel like I've finally glommed on to my personal benefit. 50 things that are true to and for me, but not necessarily to or for everybody else, or even anybody else, really. I'm not trying to tell anybody what to do here, friends. And I'm not even trying to act like this is a faithful representation of what I do. And I think that's really important. It's not a list of 50 things I execute without fail, or 50 skills I have mastered, or 50 principles that I live out perfectly day to day. It is a list of 50 things that I truly, truly believe, 50 things that I aspire to do as much as I possibly can. But to be honest, it's also 50 things I struggle with, or forget, or rebel against, or just flake out on doing. In fact, I think maybe I'll be assessing myself as I go. I kind of like the idea of giving myself an execution score maybe for each of the 50 things, just to keep myself honest. And there will be no 10 out of 10s. I can pretty much tell you that already. And yet, distilling this list has been good. It's been a great experience. It's made me reflect on what I know, but also on what remains so incredibly, beautifully, infuriatingly unknowable. This world is still a box of mystery and uncertainty. And it's also still a big, steaming mess of questions. I think when I was in my teens and 20s, I really thought that by 40, my life would be a well-ordered pantry of self-assurance and certainty and completely closed questions about who I am and what the world is about. And now, as I enter my 50s, there are so many days when I still feel like I'm living in kind of a chaotic Tupperware cabinet that's crammed full of a million questions, and then there are only a handful of answers that fit on a few of them. And I think if you told me that that was how it was all going to break down when I was 19 or 20, I would have lost my mind. But now, as I sit here at 50, and I know so much is still unresolved and so much is still yet to be discovered, it's actually kind of exciting in a way. But also, I know that I know more than I know. I understand a lot more now, at least compared to what I knew at 25 or 37 or 48, because every day is a lesson, really. It turns out I know 50 things at least. And when you know a lot more, I think it follows that you can do at least a little better for yourself and for the people around you. So, if you're at all interested in knowing what I know, or what I think I know, and holding it up against what you know, by all means, come back next week. I'll be posting a new weird podcast PowerPoint thingy right here every Monday for the next year. I'm hoping that they'll be quick and light and not all completely wrong. That's the goal. Until then, thanks so much for tolerating whatever this was and for spending a little bit of time with me on my birthday, which is happening right now if you're hearing this on the posting date. I'll be back soon with Thing 1 of 50.